Welcome to our session on front of pack labeling. We appreciate you coming here in DC, and we have a group on Zoom here today also across the country, so we welcome them. This is a tough topic, but we're going to dive into it. And before I get started, I'd like to introduce our panelists who will have a session here after I give a little talk on our findings for a white paper. They're on the screen from Minnesota, Dr. Joanne Slavin. Joanne is a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Food Agriculture and Natural Resource Sciences. She also served on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in 2010. She's written over 350 pieces, and she's been quoted quite a bit in media like the New York Times, etc. So welcome, Joanne. Thank you for joining us. And also joining us is Chris Solid, who's a Senior Director of Research and Consumer Insights at IFIC, International Food Information Council. Chris is going to share a lot of the research that they've done on labeling and consumer takeaways on it, so it'll really lend a lot of great texture to what we're talking about today. And before I start, I just want to thank a number of people who make these things happen. I'd like to thank Mona and Adriana here at Georgetown for all their hard work on this. They're the ones that make this happen. I'd also like to thank Kathy Boudet, who really helped quite a bit with researching the paper and editing it for me. So with that, we'll get started with our conversation. As you know, front of pack labeling has been proposed by the FDA here in the US. And what we're going to do today is really go through what's been going on around the world and what the net impacts are. Oftentimes we talk about just the intermediate points, whether it's sugar or sodium, saturated fats. But what this paper does is look all the way at the end points. Are we really making an impact on, let's say, arresting or reversing obesity rates or improving consumer health? Or have we totally changed consumer diets? It's a real hard look at the subject so that we can get some guidance as to where we go next with it. So I should have had that up first. So again, what we're doing is looking at the effectiveness of these panels, and then to guide policymakers and also the industry, things we need to think about on front of pack, but also other things that can be done to improve consumer health in a way that impacts them that they could comprehend easily. And then one of our final concepts is talk about one size fits all. It really doesn't work on a lot of things, whether it's policy or communication to consumer. Consumers behave so differently. And oftentimes when we get around tables here in Washington, people are pretty much attuned into nutrition and, how to live healthier lifestyles. And now we have to go meet the rest of our citizens over here who don't necessarily cooperate with what we'd like them to do for their own benefit. So that's the purpose today. And again, part of the reason for all this is the problem of obesity. In the United States, the obesity rate still remains over 40%. We now have 40 states that have obesity rates over 30%. I mean, that's a staggering number, all right? It's really challenging. And, it's really problematic because the issue is with obesity, it leads to things like diabetes and heart disease and high blood pressure, strokes, things like that. So the FDA now has a proposal out there for a nutrition info box. It's a high-end concept. In other words, high in sugars, saturated fats, and sodium that identifies the percent of the daily value that's in there. And it goes like a low, medium, high type of measure to give consumers guidance. And this is currently in a comment period. It originally was supposed to end on May 16th, but we're now understanding that might be extended, so we'll see what happens. And hopefully there's somebody actually to review the commentary that we have here. So the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has done a really good job of being the repository of information on front of pack labeling. And when you look at this chart, you can see that in the Americas, primarily South America, Mexico, and coming online, Canada, there's a mandatory rulings that are out there on these labelings. And they're called interpretive labels. By that, it means they give consumers guidance like the FDA example I just provided, as opposed to just being informative, where there's just information on the pack. And you can see that the rest of the world pretty much is in a voluntary mode. In other words, with one or two exceptions, there are various schemes which we'll go through today that are provided on package that, again, are not required, and we'll see how well they've performed. So our key takeaways before we get into the details, just so you can know where we're going. Number one is, the evidence that the front of pack labels affects, they are doing a job in some cases where we see reductions in sugars, saturated fats, and sodium. So that part we do see with some of the schemes. All right. The problem is we're not seeing the evidence as it relates to reduction in obesity rates. And what happens is a lot of work has been done tracking the reductions in sugar, sodium, et cetera. But what we don't have a good handle on is what happens to consumer diets after this. In other words, these are unpackaged products. Well, what about when there's food prepared from scratch or when they go out to eat? Food away from home. And there's no real measure of that right now. And this is called the substitution effect, which we'll get into later. There's no substantiation that it's been impacted, as I mentioned. And, what we're finding is the consumers that have the highest rates of overweight and are with obesity are reading labels the least. All right, so again, this goes back to an earlier comment. What we tend to do here in conversations among those who know health and wellness very well, it's not applying to the rest of the consumers across the country. And then finally, one of the things that I believe is overlooked is the notion of portions, especially when you talk about indulgent products. That has been totally left out of the equation, and I think there's an opportunity to incorporate those into our conversation. So with that, what we'll do is I'll start going clockwise from the upper left. We'll talk about voluntary labels that are informational, and then we'll move into those voluntary that are just interpretive or provide guidance, and then finally we'll end up with our mandatory and interpretive, the more severe labels, if you would. So let's start with the informational side. And we have Facts Up Front, which have been with us since 2012. And they're information oriented, and they provide the amount of, again, saturated fats, sodium, added sugars, and other things that could be mentioned. In this case, it's fiber and potassium, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And, there are over 200,000 items out there, which is a substantial amount of products. So it's been out there for a while. It is providing information. A couple of studies that have been conducted. NC State conducted a study, and they found out, for instance, if a product in a particular category put the nutrition facts up front on their packages, it seemed to create an improvement in nutrition for other products in that same category. We also learned that, the per serving takeaway is very clear on this package. There was a study comparing it to 4 other methods, and they found that facts up front actually were better at communicating the per serving. But again, there have really been no studies. It's not that we found counter evidence, we just haven't found any studies that really looked at the impact of this kind of labeling on things like obesity and total diet intake. So again, this is kind of like your baseline, for lack of a better term. So now let's move into the interpretive labels, okay, where they're trying to give consumers guidance. And we'll start with the oldest one, which is the keyhole, which is primarily in the Scandinavian countries. Started in Sweden, 1989. It's been around for over 35 years. And what it does is it acknowledges what's in the product. So if the product has more dietary fiber, more whole grains, or less sugars and sodium and saturated fat, that is noted. That one of those has to be met in order for the product to get a keyhole designation on the product. Consumers definitely get it. Again, it's been around forever, so they understand it. However, the obesity rates, even though in the Scandinavian countries they tend to be lower than even in the UK or the US or South America, we're still seeing that obesity rates are rising even after all this time. In Sweden, for instance, you can see the example. It was 17% in 2012, jumped up to 20%, and now 23% in 2022. So again, a labeling scheme that's been around for a long, long time ultimately hasn't prevented the rise in obesity rates. Traffic lights are used primarily in the UK. Also, Ecuador has a version of those. And again, this is a color scheme, you know, red, amber, and green. It's kind of busy if you really look at it. I mean, the color scheme is simple, but there's a lot of information on it. We do find that consumers are saying, you know, it's a little busy sometime, and it generally doesn't perform as well as some of the other systems. And what we found on the efficacy is that there is high awareness. People understand it. On the other hand, you know, it's not sticking. People aren't paying attention to it. And we're not really generating the desired results. What's interesting about this one is we actually found some information that the percent of consumers eating 5 portions of fruits and vegetables actually has come down 4 points, all right, recently. And of course, the obesity rates continue to rise during the same period. So again, you have this same thing where you have a system that's been around for a while, and we're not quite moving the needle on this. And again, let's not oversimplify it. The issue with obesity is more than just a label, all right? There's so many other factors here. But what it does say is that to look at this as a panacea is misconstrued. And then, you know, across the pond, if you would, or the channel in France, you have Nutri-Score, which also is in other Western European countries like Belgium. And this was adopted by France in 2017. And it does cover a lot of the food volume, up to 50% of the food volume in those countries where it's in. So that's the good news. They've done a number of studies. What's interesting about this one is when a product has a designation of green on it, we have seen increased consumption of the purchasing of those products, 14% higher. However, when you look at the amber or the yellow and the red products, there's hardly any change. It's just kind of up and down just a little bit. So again, on the one hand, you're seeing an improvement. On the other hand, for the products that you would design this for, you would hope for and expect a decline, and they're not seeing it with this particular model. And then, you know, a very comprehensive literature search was performed last year, and they really concluded it just wasn't effective, wasn't an effective system to make any change. And again, when you look at the obesity rates, you can see that there were increases both for adults and for 15-year-olds in this case. So again, when you go all the way to the end result, is something like this really helping to turn the tide? And we're not necessarily seeing it. There are star systems out there, which are a little bit different. There's two types of star systems. One here in the United States, which was started by Hannaford Brothers, which is part of Ahold Delhaize. They own Stop and Shop and Giant, Food Lion. And they started that system, and it's basically, you get 3 stars, 1 or 2 or 3 for good, better, best. They have a nutritional model, an algorithm that they put together on that. And what's different about the star systems is they don't necessarily denigrate a product for having, let's say, high sugar or something. They don't point that out. It's just a product has to qualify for getting a star or 2 or 3 in this system. In New Zealand and Australia, and this happens to be the New Zealand model, they have a similar system. It goes from half a point, half a star to 5 stars. And they have something, they're finding out that their goal was to have 50% of the products with this system on it. It's still hovering around 30 to 32% between those 2 countries. And they feel that they can't get anything more going on it. So they're actually looking to make this mandatory in those countries. And again, it's tough to gauge. They have very high rates of obesity. The English-speaking countries, we don't do ourselves a favor with our overweight and obesity rates. So these 2 countries behave very similar to the United States and the UK. So obesity rates remain high, and they're looking to get more compliance with this kind of system. So I think right now the jury's out on star systems, even the guiding stars. There's only 1,600 stores, primarily in the Ahold Delhaize system, and a few others. So we really don't have a good gauge if these could really make a dent into the obesity. So now let's get into the fun ones. All right, this is the real biggies here. And I'll start with black stop sign warning systems. And these are mandatory, and Chile's really been the poster child for doing very comprehensive programs, going after trying to reduce and arrest rising obesity rates. They actually started taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages in 2014. They were the first to do these kind of labels. In 2016 and in 2018, they now have bans on advertising of products that have any of these black stop signs, including adult audiences, till 10 o'clock at night. So they've really jumped in with both feet on comprehensive programs. And again, these are octagonal symbols. If you're high in calories, sugars, saturated fats, and sodium. Now, UNC has done quite a bit of work on this, and they've recorded that, just one-offs, they're seeing that there are reductions in these 4 categories of products. All right, so we are seeing that. All right, the issue though, and they recognize this in their research, that it's only a portion of the population, and they don't capture any out-of-home consumption that consumers may have, which could be very substantial because there's a lot more fast food going on in Chile also right now, and also from scratch, also on the caloric side. So we don't have a measure of what the total diet really looks like. Is this causing Chileans to consume, let's say, fewer calories, or is the composition of their diets better? There is some evidence that they're pointing out, particularly in Peru, which is another country which has these kind of labels, where there might be some product reformulation going on among the companies because of these stop signs. Just a word from the work we did with the National Confectioners Association with creating the Always a Treat program, where they made a commitment to sell more products under 200 calories. We learned in that particular instance that it wasn't necessarily a lot of reformulation that was going on, but rather that there were discontinuances of products. So, and as I mentioned to Jerry earlier here, food industry really spends very low percentage of their budgets on R&D. And if I have to call for anything, I would like to see that number go up a little bit more. There's some companies like Nestle that do spend a lot more. I think there's an opportunity for food companies to do that, with or without labels, if you would. And then the real challenge, of course, is overweight and obesity. Just that trend continues to go up. And these are some examples of some studies that were done actually among very young children. They actually saw a little drop the first year, but then it rebounded right afterwards in the second year by 2018. And then with ninth graders, we actually saw an increase 2 to 3 percentage points 3 years later. So it wasn't sticking. But here's the key to me. When you look at the trend in Chile, this is like just an irrepressible march of obesity. This is obesity rates combined with overweight. Every year, 0.9 to 1% increase. Every year, year after year, year after year, year after year. And you can see here in 2014, again, the sugar-sweetened beverage tax. Then in red, you have the black stop sign labels, and then the ad bans in 2018. It's almost like they're ignored. It's just ignoring the fact that anything's being done. No sways, no ups, no down, every year, year after year. The Pan American Health Organization projects that obesity rates might hit 87%, obesity and overweight, maybe 87% by 2030. I think that's a straight line projection, so it's probably a little too aggressive, but this country will have rates of over 80%. It may be now. This is 2022 data, which is the latest. They're probably at 80% right now. It's a tough circumstance. And so I understand the rationale for trying to do anything and everything to try to help the Chilean population. But again, what this shows is, and I'll get into a McKinsey study momentarily, but it's really challenging to turn this around with some of the manipulations we try to do, whether it's on labels or advertising. Now, Canada is jumping in January 1st of 2026. This is kind of like what the FDA is proposing, actually a little simpler. It's just the black, too high in saturated fat, sugars, or sodium. They did some studies which showed that their obesity rates had jumped up from 22% or 21% up to 30%. So that was their basis. They say, hey, Houston, we have a problem with obesity here. So they're making this mandatory. So they will join this group at the first of the year. So let's talk a little bit about reading labels from a consumer perspective. We've done quite a bit of work. We did our, here at Georgetown, did our Power of Portions report last year out of our Portion Balance Coalition. And we did a lot, marketers do a lot of work doing consumer segmentation. It's very important. So you have all the way on the left here, the most healthy, the well-beings, and then fence sitters a little less, fence sitters have a lot of kids, and then it starts dropping off. Your highest rates of overweight and obesity reside with the magic bullets, and the Eat, Drink, and Be Merry speaks for itself. So that's where you start from, and you say, okay, well, what are the nutrition label reading habits like? And you can see that, guess what, the well-beings, they're all over it. They're reading everything. And in fact, there's a subset of this group that's already memorized every ingredient on the package, and they can tell you what farm it was planted on in Ghana. What happens, though, is as you move off to the right, and those where the overweight and obesity goes up, it just drops off so radically. So you have less than a third, if not less than a quarter, with the Eat, Drink, and Be Merrys, even reading this stuff. So it makes it challenging because, I hate to say it this way, we're kind of talking to ourselves on this because, again, those who are attuned to healthy lifestyles and healthy eating are paying attention. That's the good news. But then we have to go to the rest of us, and it's not translating to the rest of the population. And that's where I like to come to portions on this thing. This is a McKinsey study. And McKinsey is a little dated, but they looked at all of the interventions, and they did the study in the UK, and they looked at disability-adjusted life years. In other words, how many more years of healthy living can you get if these kinds of strategies were implemented? And, portion control, they called it, and also, secondly, reformulation really had the biggest impact. But as you go down the list, you can see things like the labeling and the taxation and advertising bans are way down the list. They're not making much of a blip in this. So this is why I'm big on the impact of what portions can make, because this is tangible data, all right, where they saw the impact with audiences of consumers. So that's why I'd like to see portions put into the mix here. And it also allows, consumers are still telling us they want to treat, all right, but maybe they don't want to do face plants into vats of chocolate as often, all right? They still enjoy it, so how do we give it to them in a way that helps them manage their intake of calories, et cetera? And then the other thing, and this is IFIC data from Chris's company, that portions now rose to the top of the list as far as an element of a healthy eating pattern. All right, so people are paying more attention to how much they buy. So again, incorporating this has kind of been left out of the equation because of our focus on individual ingredients. So just top-lining some conclusions. First of all, the empirical evidence is not there. Okay, we're not seeing it. We see some changes in ingredients based on some of the mandatory labels, but we're not seeing it translate all the way. And we need to do more of these substitution. Now, if we're really going to wrap our hands around this, we need to find out what people are doing with everything they eat all day long, including, their activity too. I mean, we tend to ignore the activity. There is definitely less activity now. We don't want to blame lack of activity because there's plenty we can do with our foods. But we need to get a better handle on the total picture of what their diet looks like. And again, we're finding that the least healthy are not reading the most. Some of the schemes did increase the sales of healthier items, but they didn't really do much to the items in the yellow and the red area. So we're not seeing the desired impact. And then portion management, as I just managed, I like to see that integrated. And let's not forget that consumers do want transparency. We're not suggesting that don't communicate to consumers. We need to communicate to consumers. They need to know what's inside their products. We owe them that from an industry perspective. So I'm not going to lose that. 72% of them actually say, that helps them feel good about their companies. So let's talk about the implications of what we mean here. All right, warning labels are not a panacea. I think we've proven that it's not getting the job done. All right, the ultimate consequences, we need to get a handle on. And actually what I'd like to see from a policy standpoint is first, whether you conduct trials in countries to get total diet reads on the consumer and work backwards to see which ones are the most effective before we implement a policy. Let's do that first. Instead of implement the policy, think it's going to work because it comes across as, let's say, more draconian. And again, not seeing the kind of results. We have to go to the right consumer. Let's not design, whether it's labels or any other strategy we use, for the wrong consumer audience, all right? I think we're doing that right now. Portion management, again, we need to incorporate it. We need the entire food industry involved too. Packaged foods companies, I was involved a little bit in the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation and a little bit on the confectionery industry commitment. On healthy weight, packaged goods companies pulled out 6.5 trillion calories out of the food supply. All right, big number, huge number. And there have been a lot of reductions across the board. Missing in action are the restaurant trade and food service. The portions are astronomical. We haven't seen any hard commitments. There is Kids Live Well, where they offer 2 items on the menu to sign up for that program. But I really would like to see the restaurant industry engaged, because we need them to be engaged. If we're going to affect the total diets, if they're on the sidelines, then how do you fix the problem? And then finally, I really like to see an update of this McKinsey study. I mean, it's old, but nevertheless, it's very accurate. And I think that will help us understand the priority of actions we need to take so we could make more impact. So with that, let's get into our panel discussion. Chris, if you can join me up here, and we'll get Joanne online. Let me just get my papers. So do we have Joanne with us? There she is. Hello, Joanne. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Thanks for including me.
Oh, no, thank you for being with us. At least you're getting some nice weather up there in Minnesota now.
Sunny and beautiful every day. Can't beat it.
Having lived there 3 times, I know you're lying to me. So.
It's always sunny. I didn't say it was always warm, but it's pretty much always sunny.
It is sunny. So, Joanne, let me start with you. I'd like to get your opinion. You know, you've been outspoken in several cases on front of pack labeling, and I'd like to get, what's the role of it, or is there a role for front of pack labeling, and just how do you view it?
Yeah, well, I probably need to do all my disclosures, which would take the rest of the time, all the people that I've worked with. Remember, too, I started as a dietitian, so that's the way I one single food does not mean anything. So one package of food, to put information on it to say this is a good or a bad food, is not going to help. So I've never been a big believer in it, because first of all that information's already on the package. So to me, it's a bit insulting that we're telling people this is a good food or a bad food based on 3 metrics that if this food is only a sugar-containing food, of course it's full of sugar and all that information's there. So I just find it kind of disrespectful to people to expect that by putting this information, black stop signs on the front, that people are going to feel guilty enough to not buy the product, when it's very clear what's in the product, whether it's sodium, saturated fat, or sugar. All that information's there. And remember too, I'm a fiber person, so most of my life I stay on the positive side, and I say A or fiber. And most things, if you look at any single food, it provides some of the positive nutrients and it provides some of the negative nutrients. And I'm much more committed to getting all the nutrients we need into people, rather than worrying about these bad guys all the time.
So you would do it as a comprehensive, both positive and other, whatever is in the food, communicate
it's
with
already
someone.
there. The nutrition facts panel, you have picked out the nutrients that are important, and people, if they're in the cereal business or anywhere else and they put in other nutrients, they can put that on their label for information. So for me, the information is there. If people want it, they can easily turn it over and figure it out. So I got to remember too that I teach advanced human nutrition and hammer all the time on, we have 4 nutrients of concern we don't get in the US: calcium, vitamin D, potassium, fiber. And, anytime we come up with policies that decrease those, we're just losing the battle. So nutrients have not gone away. I believe in nutrients. And then all these things of these are the really bad guys, it's all got to be looked at in the total diet.
Well, it's interesting, because when we did our research for this paper, we did find out that in some studies, the consumers were playing back that, hey, I know a product is indulgent, so we noticed that that's one of the reasons why we didn't see much change in the purchasing of, let's say, the products that had red or yellow on them, because consumers were saying they already knew. That's why some of the green ones did go up, because they were pleasantly surprised or reminded about purchasing those products. So that's kind of compatible with what you're saying. So Chris, what are you seeing with consumers? Obviously you've done many studies in this arena. What are consumers telling you about front of pack labeling and, where they're getting their information and how they prefer to get their information?
We've done a few studies on front of pack. Our most recent one was published in 2024. So I think that one's a little bit more germane to today's conversation. The original study we did was in 2021. When these concepts were a little bit more abstract, there wasn't a proposal, for example, from the FDA. So when you ask consumers about the information they're viewing on front of pack, that includes health claims of various sorts. In the study we conducted in 2023 and published in 2024 was exposing consumers to the proposed front of pack labels. So we have a little bit more information about how they responded to those. Happy to talk more about that, but what we do know is that people are looking to the front of the package for that information. We've asked consumers over the years to tell us, getting to the front versus the side or the back, where do they go for information? A lot of people are looking at all of it. So I think when we say front of pack in this room, we know what we're talking about. I'm not sure that a consumer understands exactly what we're talking about, and that's why I kind of mentioned that our 2024 study is a little bit more germane to this conversation. But one thing I should say, one thing we do know is that consumers are looking all around food packages for more information compared to what they were doing, say, 10 years ago. And we're going to have some data coming out later this year that's going to express that pretty clearly. And so we know that consumers are tuned in, not just the more nutrition literate, not just the higher educated, not just the higher income. Although those folks are very tuned in, this has to do with the entire population.
Are you seeing anything tying, let's say, front of pack information to purchases? Or you also mentioned something to me about some work you're doing on the time consumers spend on packaging. I think that would be very revealing to the audience.
Yeah, we did measure time in our front of pack labeling study. We don't measure, we measure intent to purchase, so I would defer to other data sets, Nielsen or NHANES for consumption, or there are entities that collect the market data that would tell us a lot more. Maybe the retailers, I'm sure, have that information. So I think it's important to compare data sets. I don't see enough of that, frankly. I don't know if that's proprietary type information. I often think about my coupon card when you scan at the grocery store. Who does that information belong to? Is that mine? Can I request it? Are they using that probably to market to me sales, other products? But that data exists. If my profile can tell me for the last decade, here's what you've purchased, here's how it's changed. I think that's something to explore, but that's not the domain that we do at IFIC. That's not our realm.
Okay. Joanne, I wanted to ask you, we presented quite a bit of obesity data here in the various countries that do have some stringent labeling requirements. Have you seen anything in your studies or your readings that tell you there's any linkage between these kind of labels and arresting or reversing obesity rates?
Not at all, and I think it's too far of a trip, right? So if you think, how would we expect that to actually work? I think that's where I would be shocked to be able to find that. I just don't see how that would work. And I want to follow up on something Chris said too, is I think as scientists, we're really behind where consumers are. So we're stuck on saturated fat, sodium, and added sugar, and consumers are way past that. So I go back to, what should we need to tell them? That information is there. Portion size, incredibly important. That's my dietetics. Anything can fit into the diet, just eat less of it. That's so basic that nobody even thinks about it, but it's the number one thing with obesity. Calories do count for sure. And then all these things consumers are looking for right now. They're looking for colors. They're looking for ultra processed foods. The information that's there, why would we expect sodium to have anything to do with obesity anyway? So, I think and it's because we have to stick with the dietary guidelines, which I agree with. I don't disagree. If you go back to why are those the things that are going to be on front of pack if front of pack goes forward, I don't disagree with that, because that has to go along with the dietary guidelines. But to get all this to line up for what consumers are looking for, and then to expect to see people to lose weight, that's just not realistic. It's not, why would we expect that? There's no way we should expect that. So I'm not surprised the results you showed is we're not seeing that. And I also, have to go back to BMI as our indicator of being obese too. That a lot of the data we're looking at BMI, most people are saying, hey, BMI really goes after people that are fit. People that are really fit are also obese. So it's a good marker because it's one marker we can get at. So it's a good one to model. That's why we use it. But getting into that field too, as we chase obesity with BMI, that's also a hole in our data as we move forward on this.
Do you have any thoughts? You mentioned portions again, and again, I'm a big fan of it just because of many benefits. I mean, from manufacturer standpoint, you don't have to go through the full R&D and reformulation to do that. How do we integrate that? A lot of these algorithms that are being used, let's say for the stars and all that, they're strictly nutrition information, and they don't incorporate anything about portions. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's important too, as you talked about the restaurant industry. So I've been at a lot of meetings where the restaurant industry will say, well, wait a second, it costs us, our labor costs are the same, all these costs, giving people higher portions is the cheapest thing we can do, right? And then they're happy. So, this idea of how do we make money and how do we monetize everything? And I think that's really tough for the restaurant business that when they are trying, and as prices are going up right now and all the concern with that typically giving people smaller portions, they could control that themselves. If you look at the new nutrition facts panel, what do we do now? We say, hey, this is the number of calories in this 22-ounce drink. We're hoping you don't drink the whole 22-ounce drink, but you maybe will. So again, all that information's already there for people to figure it out. All the restaurants will say, hey, we've got all the calorie information for you. Everything you eat, if you split it with somebody, hey, there's half the calories. That's your solution. But for us, why should we be responsible for telling you how many calories to eat? That's not our job.
Okay. No, I just wanted to get that perspective. Again, we have our Portion Balance Coalition here at Georgetown, and any insights we welcome. So, Chris, I got into something about we showed the different consumer segments. And you've done some work that shows there is a distinction across, let's say, nutrition literate consumers versus other consumers. What kind of differences are you seeing there in the way they're viewing the labels and perhaps health in general?
Yeah, one of the things that we find often in our data, they cluster when we do any study, whether it's about labeling, whether it's about perceptions of health or behaviors. We're talking about higher educated, we're talking about higher income, we're talking about often older, maybe sometimes younger, depending. We see that the younger generations tend to look more at the front of pack than others. They trust it just a little bit more. So there are differences for sure. We see that when it comes to interpretation and confidence in the label, that's something that cuts across almost every demographic. There are only about half of people who say they're very confident in understanding the nutrition facts label. So there's differences there. And of course, the people who test higher in nutrition literacy have more confidence. They're able to use the information more often. They seek it out more often. They use it more often to impact a purchase. So we see that. So lower nutrition literacy subjects, people who have lower incomes, don't use it as often. So I know one of the rationale for putting front of pack labeling on foods here in the U.S. is to help lower nutrition literate portions of our population. So putting it up front, I guess the theory is that they'll use it more, but really understand it more. How will they apply it? So I think those are the things in our study we've tried to uncover. More research would probably be helpful in those ways. But I would just say that labeling is just one form of communication that people hear about food. They're picking up information from multiple sources, whether that be online through social media, whether that be from authorities. And so the way we speak about food, particularly those nutrients that we know are hot button and polarizing issues, particularly sugar, we've found in a lot of our studies there's more concern for sugar than there are for saturated fat or sodium grams. on labels. So we've picked that up in our front of pack. So and if you listen to some of the rhetoric that's still happening today, even just a couple of days ago, sugar is poison, apparently. So what is a consumer hearing? So we're going to put these 3 nutrients on the label, on the front of the package. In essence, we're signaling to a consumer, these are the 3 nutrients you should be caring about the most. But they're going to have differences in the way they feel about each of those 3 nutrients. So something that's high in sugar might be something people would avoid more than something that's high in saturated fat or high in sodium. So the mixture of those levels of nutrients that are appearing on the label along with that interpretive language, whether it's high, medium, or low, we know is going to have an impact on consumers. In addition to food categories. So there are differences in the way people feel about breakfast cereal, for example, versus something like canned soup. We know they're looking for different nutrients in those food categories. They prioritize those differently. One of the things we found in our most recent FOP study was that in canned soup, for example, people are honing in on sodium more than they are for breakfast cereal. It makes a lot of sense. That's the nutrient of importance when they're looking at a product that they expect to be high in a certain nutrient, versus something like breakfast cereal where we're seeing people look more at things like added sugars and even fiber, which is not on the front of pack, or at least in the proposal at this point.
So given your work on front of pack, Dr. Slavin, I know you've had some concepts out there. If we had to do a front of pack label, I know you had some concepts with indices that you had developed a number of years back. What would be your preference if there is a front of pack labeling that's required? What would be ideal in your perspective?
Yeah, I think you got to give people some positive vibes rather than just getting after them. So I do think the nutrient-rich index, some of those where you're getting some positive vibes for getting fiber into the diet, and all these nutrients. If we have 4 nutrients of concern: calcium, vitamin D, potassium, and fiber, let's give you some points for scoring on those. And especially if I'm a formulator of my product, if I'm trying to get those into my product to enhance nutrition, because those are nutrients we don't get enough of. So I guess that to me, more it's the carrot versus the stick. And the way we see it, there's these 3 bad guys that are coming front and center, and we're going to get after them. And obviously, there's a lot of food that has a lot of saturated fat in it. It has a lot of added sugar in it, or has a lot of sodium. And as Chris pointed out too, people kind of hear things like don't eat canned soup. But if you look at a lot of the bread products and the grain products, they actually have more sodium per serving than some of the canned soup. So telling people never eat this category, always eat this category, even though we think that's helpful, if there's sodium and their blood pressure's up, they need to look at sodium. Though that information is there, they need to say it. And canned soups can be actually quite good sources of fiber, potassium, other things. So rather than just say never eat a canned soup because it's high in sodium, giving them some positives on the front. If things have to be on the front, I would prefer that you're going to get some bonus points for what you're doing right rather than a spanking for what you're doing wrong.
So when you look at the whole picture, making our population healthier and tackling the obesity issue, what kind of recommendations would you have, to industry or to the public health community? Just you've been engaged in this for a long time. So I'm just curious, based on what you've learned and what you think might be effective or what needs to be done, what's your overall take on it?
Remember I've been in it for a very long time. And to me, it's enjoy your food and make it part of your community. Because when we eat, like we're at the gas station, right? So we say, hey, I've had too much sodium. I'm going to dial this down. I find with kids and grandkids that the key thing is to help people. I also own a farm, grew up on a farm, and I'm really connected to food. And here's an animal, here's a chicken. It just laid an egg. It has amazing protein in it. So kind of this thing of food as a celebration. Food is so central. 3 times a day, we have a way to improve our health, and it's incredible. We can make better choices every time. So I just think the community of having lunch together, having dinner with your family, having time around food, that's a positive experience, helping kids learn how to prepare food and understand there aren't bad foods or good foods. It's really just putting it together in the number of calories you need and getting these nutrients in a lot of really respectful ways that are not that expensive. So it is a big ask to make all these things come together. that as a community, we're going to have food for everybody. There's going to be food security, but it can be a celebration rather than punishment all the time. And that you need to control your own food environment, which means learning how to cook and learning how to source your food and supporting your family and getting that food in a positive way.
All right. Well, thank you to the panel. I want to leave enough time for any questions here and also for those online with us to make sure we have a few extra minutes for some questions. Anyone here have some questions for Dr. Slavin or Chris? Yes.
Thanks, Hank. Hi, Leslie Crutchfield with Georgetown University, our Business for Impact initiative. Really appreciate our speakers and our guests for this really illuminating panel and presentation, Hank. My question is about, given the data that Hank shared earlier about how guidance labeling may be having an impact in terms of choosing the healthier option more, but not, reducing your choices of the less healthy options. We did a case study at Georgetown a few years ago about a beverage company, AB InBev, they made a corporate responsibility commitment to trying to reduce harmful drinking, which included putting warning labels on all of their beer and now other alcohol products, which same results, right? It didn't necessarily change drinking behavior. What did, with evidence, change drinking behavior was when they coupled that with social marketing advertising campaigns. So, Aguila beer selling, in the ad campaigns, the idea of instead of partying all night in Brazil, because it's a big party culture in Brazil, alternate one water, one beer. And then they also had promotions where they were encouraging consumers to eat between beer, right? So it was reducing the overall harmful consumption. And when those ad campaigns were running, they saw both attitude and behavior change among consumers. So I'm wondering if there's anything beyond in any of the panelists or Hank, your work that talks about beyond the label, how other marketing initiatives can help actually get that behavior change, which is ultimately what's going to move the dial on our obesity problems.
I can comment, just not on our work, but in general, me as a person. I think I would love to see more behavioral economists in our world. The more I learn about nutrition and health and food, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but it's like the more I learn, the less I feel like it matters. And because it's our behavior, it's our upbringing with food, it's how it's ingrained into our culture and our daily lives. And those are a part of the millions of choices we make, throughout our lives. So our familiarity with taste and, how we deal with money and how we interact with people, I think matters. And it's not about the grams and the nutrients and the food that we consume, and you can learn all day, every day about how healthy broccoli is and how, less healthy some other foods are. But if you're not, if you don't have the culinary skill or the aptitude or the motivation to choose those foods and who you're surrounding yourselves with, your social circles, all of those things have such a great impact. Now, labeling can help, but I just think that it's only one dynamic in a world full of influences.
Joanne, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thing, I get really frustrated that alcohol is run by another group. It's not FDA, so we don't have nutrition labels. We don't have calories on that. And so I think that's really unfair to consumers, as alcoholic beverages could be a huge calorie source and then not only do we have all the calories, do we have alcohol that is a drug, right? And is illegal and, for age things. So because we're kind of, I can see why the social thing would work better than just lecturing people that, hey, you're getting a ton of calories from this alcohol, these beverages. So if you switch it up with water, that's going to be better for you. And that's all the detail we need. It is behavioral rather than let's look at the label and there's this many grams of alcohol and there's 7 calories per gram, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's just lecturing and, just like that, when my kids are like, enough, I don't eat anymore. So I think you're exactly right that the behavioral thing, and that's where advertising bringing, I think as nutritionists and a lot of public health people, advertising's bad, marketing's bad, economics is bad, and all these things affect food choices. And when somebody is running a plant and they're making food for us that's healthy, convenient, and low cost, we should say thank you rather than just say, hey, we need to put another label on to decrease your sales of a product with information that consumers aren't it's not gonna help them lose weight. I mean, obviously, the idea of getting at a overall healthy weight is very much your access to healthcare and your access to a healthy environment. So I think that we lose sight of that we think if we're going to put some label on there, we would expect that there would be fewer obese people when they have to work 3 jobs to even pay for groceries. It's just not realistic. So I really appreciate people doing work like that because it's harder. And that's why I think the nice thing about this white paper too, to pull all this information together that's out there, it's a huge ask to say, hey, let's look at the programs that already exist and see what kind of outcomes we have before we move down the path to doing something that may not have that much impact.
Yeah, and alcohol is a really interesting example, so I'm glad you brought that up. I'm old enough to remember when McUltra was introduced and the hyper focus on the grams of carbs in beer was like fascinating to me. This is even before I was in nutrition. And so I never really got into that, I don't know if that moved the needle on obesity or not, but I do know that the younger generations are not drinking in the same, volumes that older generations are. So what kind of an impact is that going to have on health? Gen Z and Gen Alpha are, significantly less interested in drinking.
But I also find that beverages are a huge part of our whole social culture around the world. So rather than say never take in a beverage that has sugar in it or alcohol, it's like smaller amounts, appropriate, don't drink alone. There's a lot of behavioral things that are really important rather than just saying get rid of all sugar sweetened beverages. It's like, well, that's not going to happen. That's not a smart message for people. Let's just put it into our culture and realize there's a lot of social aspects around beverages that are important that we don't just get rid of because of the nutrients.
And I might add on this conversation, thank you for your responses, the context in which we eat, drink, whether it's alcoholic or not, really matters, right? And cultural influences. So our biggest harmful alcohol problem in the United States is underage and binge drinking, right? Because of part of it is because our drinking age is higher than most other parts of the world. But also, in Brazil and Latin cultures, it's more about the night starts late, goes later, and so it's overconsumption, alcohol poisoning. In South Africa, it's related to soccer matches and violence after games and that kind of thing from overconsumption. So the context matters. So to your point, Chris, about we need more behavioral economics and marketing experts who can look at how you actually persuade people to do and think differently, rather than just assume we put the information on the label. And to Hank's point earlier, another thing I think we could really look at is what we call the boomerang effect in public health. So I think about our research for the Portion Balance Coalition, looking at what was the impact of restaurant labeling. When all restaurants with more than, I think, 25 franchises were required to put the calories up on the fast food and fast casual chains. And what did we see? To your point, Hank, the super healthy well-beings were reading the calorie labels and not choosing, the high calorie worse for you. And most of it probably weren't eating at McDonald's anyway, right? But the Eat, Drink, and Be Merry and the far right of your screen, they definitely weren't reading the calorie labels. And if they were, there was evidence that some of the lower income, 3-job, single parents were choosing the items with the highest calories because they wanted the most calories to satiate their children for the least amount of money, so they would not complain and they would have fulfilled their duty, right? So that's the boomerang effect. When you choose the highest calorie options for different reasons than we in, rational economic man might presume. So a lot more in this behavioral economic space. I think there's opportunity.
And there might be implications for that on front of pack labeling when it comes to entire meals versus single products, and then how do people think about confection or smaller items versus something that's a little bit more akin to or supposed to be served as an entire meal?
Yeah, all the eating occasions. And that goes back to Hank's point. We need data about the whole eating basket across the day, not just individual points. I don't want to hog the microphone.
No,
Other
that's
questions?
good. By the way, I have to recuse myself on that question, having been a former Michelob brand manager, so. I wanted to say one other thing to the second half of your question, and that what can be done, let's say, by industry here. You know, there are a lot of things besides portions that can be done. We don't talk anymore about, for lack of a better term, public service advertising, and now it would be on social media rather than on TV. But there's an opportunity for corporations to, you know, let's face it, there's a freight train on the track. There's a lot of talk, not only about this, but ultra-processed foods, things like that, that I think industry would gain if they got ahead of some of these issues and started doing some things, again, whether it's combining together to get messages out about how to properly eat or to manage portions or whatever else the message is. A, it would be smart for business, and B, it would be good for their consumers. So I think we have to start thinking like that. Again, we spoke about the R&D being very low % for the industry. There is an opportunity to get ahead with other reformulations. Again, if you can deliver health, taste great, first of all, the first three criteria, taste, then convenience, then affordability, and then health is on the list. If you can deliver all four of those, you really have a home run for a product. So I think industry has an opportunity to look at those situations where they can deliver that.
I want to jump into, and just as somebody that lives in rural America, the importance of plants and production facilities for social, you know, for jobs and for the culture. And so I think we forget about that. So often people haven't been around plants. They don't understand how important those are for rural communities that have these plants that bring amazing products to consumers that are convenient, safe, and low cost. So no appreciation for that. And I think we need to start promoting that as companies that support really good plants that get food onto the table.
Yeah. Anybody online have any questions that we picked up? Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Yes, Mara.
My question goes to a little bit about the press conference that happened with HHS and FDA earlier this week. I'm just wondering if the panel has any reactions to the statements made by the participants in the press conference, from government officials to the non-government officials that were there, and what should the public take from that public health announcement by FDA and HHS?
Which particular?
The one on dyes.
The one on dyes, okay. Joanne, you have any thoughts on that?
I did not attend it. I have some thoughts, but if somebody attended it, they should talk first, because mine is just based on some other questions I got from people.
I viewed it. I think one thing that's interesting is I don't know if it's a difference, but the way people feel about things versus the underpinning science for those things. There's a lot of momentum for various things right now that maybe aren't backed with the right amount of science to do the thing that people feel like should be done. So I think it's an interesting way to balance people feeling like they're being heard, like they're getting what they want, industry and others in government are hearing them, and then the response or the rationale for those actions to be taken at a regulatory level should be matched with validation, you know, in the literature and science. But it's a tough thing for consumers to hear when oftentimes on some of our most polarizing issues, the literature doesn't always align with the way people feel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the science needs to rule on those. We did a paper here a couple of years ago on low no-calorie sweeteners, a very in-depth analysis with two outstanding academic reviewers. And we concluded, number one, that they are safe. All right, they're safe. Number two, they're efficacious. In other words, there were several random and controlled trials that showed that they were as good, if in one case even better than water, in helping to manage weight. And again, that doesn't mean everybody jumps into these products. It just means that it's an inconvenient truth. All right, and I think we're in the same waters right now with dyes, artificial colors, et cetera. There are inconvenient truths out there, and we need the science behind each one of these to determine. If they are harmful, we don't want them in foods, okay? I don't think anyone's saying that. But if they're not harmful, then why should they be penalized? Just because they fit under an umbrella. I think the umbrella these days is, quote, artificial. We found that with the sweeteners. So if it falls under the artificial umbrella, it's automatically deemed bad, and you have to get rid of it instead of letting, as Chris said, letting the science speak.
I would jump into, obviously, I'm a scientist, and it's really sad to me that people have turned away from science. So I'm going to start there. Also, that there are choices, that this is America and we allow choices. There's risk benefit of all decisions. So alternative sweeteners, colors, they're in the product in a safe amount. They're on the label so you can avoid them as you want. That's already available. We don't need to ban them. We don't need bans. And then the final thing is it has to be a national plan. It can't be every state for themselves banning things. It just creates horrible disorder for the whole community of us. So before every state says, I'm going to ban a food color, there needs to be a national policy, and it needs to be based on science. So we need to get back to that.
Yep.
FDA is our friend. FDA is an amazing, all these government organizations are incredible. We need to partner with them and make sure we do the right thing for our consumers. And I agree with Chris, consumers need to be heard. So if they feel like they haven't been heard, we need to open those channels up so they feel like they are being heard.
Mara, just one extra comment. I don't know, others are probably more versed in the regulatory and labeling world, but if an alternative color or dye is used to replace one of the petroleum-based ones they're talking about that is not inherent or expected to be in that food, I don't know, is it true that it would still have to be labeled artificial? So in that sense, that part of the word is almost meaningless. Like beet juice going in for strawberry juice, for example, would be the same color, but if it's not inherent to that food, then it's an added or artificial flavor or color, correct?
It has to be approved through the color process.
Right.
All right. Any other questions before we adjourn? Thank you, Dr. Slavin. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, audience, for this great panel. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you online, too. Okay. Thank you.